When Shaquille O'Neal walked past a busy art stand on a city sidewalk, most people didn't even notice him. Just another person, another face in the crowd. But when he stopped, picked up a painting, and listened to the girl running the stand, everything changed. Because this wasn't just any artist, Isabella George was fighting for more than just recognition. She was painting to save her own life from brain cancer. And what happened next became a moment no one would forget. Because in true Shaquille O'Neal style, he didn't just buy a painting, he changed her future forever. Like, share, and subscribe to the channel to see how the story unfolds. The room was dim and cold with bright lights above humming softly, casting a pale glow on the white walls. The smell of antiseptic filled the air, mixing with the quiet beeping of monitors in the next room. Isabella George sat on the crinkled hospital bed, her hands curled into tight fists in her lap. Across from her, Dr. Naresh adjusted his glasses, his face calm but serious. Isabella already knew what was coming. She had heard this voice before. Gentle, careful, the kind doctors used when they had bad news to share. "The treatment is working," he said, a small glimmer of hope in his tone. "But you'll need at least 2 more rounds." Isabella barely reacted. She was used to this, the pain, the sickness, the exhaustion. It had become a part of her life. But what she wasn't used to was what he said next. "I understand your family is struggling with the costs," he continued. "Unfortunately, without insurance coverage, the next round will be—" He hesitated, then sighed. "Expensive." Her mother let out a shaky breath beside her. Isabella didn't need to look to know she was holding back tears. The medical bills had already drained them. Their savings were gone. The last round of treatment had pushed them to the limit, and now this? For the first time in a long time, fear crept into Isabella's chest. Not fear of dying, but fear of watching her parents lose everything trying to save her. The drive home was silent. Her mother gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her father's voice had been rough when he told her everything would be okay, but Isabella could hear the lie in it. That night, lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling, heart pounding. She refused to be a burden. She wouldn't let her parents drown in debt because of her. And then an idea struck her. Art had always been her escape, her passion. If she could create something that mattered, something people would want to buy, maybe she could fight back in her own way. By morning, Isabella had made up her mind. She wasn't going to wait for a miracle. She was going to make one. The first stroke of paint always felt like magic. The brush glided over the canvas, leaving behind soft blues and bold oranges, the colors blending to form something new, something alive. Isabella sat on a foldable stool, her art stand set up on a busy downtown sidewalk, ready to change her own future. The small wooden table in front of her was covered with neatly arranged canvases, each one a piece of her heart. Her mom had helped her set up the stand that morning, but the rest was up to Isabella. This had been her idea, after all. She had spent the last week pouring all her energy into these paintings, knowing this wasn't just about art anymore, it was about survival. If she could sell enough, if people saw value in what she created, maybe she could afford the treatment that could save her life. But hope was a fragile thing. People walked by, some glancing at her table, others not noticing at all. A woman in a navy blazer slowed down for a second, admiring a painting before shaking her head and moving on. A man in sunglasses and a sharp suit stopped just long enough to read the small handwritten sign in front of her booth. Original art? Funding my cancer treatment. His mouth tightened, then he turned and walked away. Isabella exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the table to steady herself. The afternoon heat pressed down on her, making her feel lightheaded. Hours had passed, and she hadn't sold a single painting. She reached for her water bottle, her hands trembling slightly as she took a sip. Fatigue weighed on her bones, a cruel reminder that she wasn't just fighting for people's attention, but against her own body. Still, giving up wasn't an option. She forced a smile as an elderly couple in their late 50s approached. The woman's eyes lit up with curiosity. "These are beautiful," she murmured, running her fingers lightly over the edge of a canvas. It was a piece Isabella had poured her heart into, a vast desert sky painted in deep purples and streaks of gold. How much for this one? The woman asked. Isabella swallowed. $67.89? The woman glanced at her husband, who gave a small nod. We'll take it. For a second, Isabella didn't move. She had imagined this moment so many times, but now that it was happening, she felt frozen. Then, as the woman handed her the cash, something inside Isabella cracked open. Her first sale, her first victory. She held onto that feeling as she carefully packed the painting into a paper bag. The couple walked away, leaving Isabella with $67.89 and a renewed sense of purpose. Maybe she was just one girl selling art on a street corner, but she was fighting, and she wasn't done yet. The city buzzed with life. Street musicians played guitars on the corners, their melodies mixing with the hum of traffic. Tourists wandered past, snapping photos of murals painted on old brick buildings. Businessmen, focused on their phones, brushed by without a second glance. Isabella sat at her small table, hands resting on her knees, watching the world move around her. It was strange, being surrounded by so many people but still feeling invisible. She had only sold one painting so far. Every time someone looked her way, hope sparked in her chest. Maybe this time, maybe this person would stop, admire her work, and see her not as a girl begging for charity, but as an artist. Most didn't. Some slowed their steps, glanced at the canvases, then kept walking. Others didn't notice her at all, and then there were those who stopped, but only to offer pity, not support. A middle-aged woman in a fancy floral dress sighed as she read Isabella's sign. "Oh, honey," she murmured, her voice full of sympathy. "I wish I could help, but I just don't have the money." Isabella smiled politely. "That's okay. Thank you for stopping." The woman lingered, her gaze heavy. "You poor thing, you must be so brave." That word again. She had heard it so many times since her diagnosis, but it never felt right. She wasn't brave. She was desperate. She was exhausted. But still, she nodded, let the woman say kind words, then watched her walk away, just like all the others. Not long after, a different kind of customer showed up. A man in a leather jacket, sunglasses resting on his head, strolled up to her stand. He glanced at the paintings for a moment before letting out a low, amused scoff. "Nobody buys real art anymore, kid," he muttered. "You should try selling prints, or, I don't know, TikTok commissions." Isabella's hands clenched into fists. She bit back the sharp response on the tip of her tongue, swallowing the anger burning in her throat. She had dealt with people like this before, people who didn't understand, who thought dreams weren't worth chasing. "I don't need your advice," she said simply. "I just need to fight." The man snorted but didn't argue. He walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Isabella let out a slow breath. She refused to let frustration win. Because somewhere in this city, maybe today, maybe tomorrow, someone would see her. And that would change everything. By the fourth day, Isabella was exhausted. Her body ached from sitting on the hard metal stool, her muscles weak from brain tumor treatments. The summer heat pressed against her skin, making her dizzy. She had sold 3 paintings in total. It wasn't enough, not even close. She tried to stay hopeful, but reality was creeping in. Maybe the man in the leather jacket was right, maybe no one cared. And then, out of nowhere, someone stopped. Not just any customer, a journalist. She looked to be in her early 30s, carrying a notebook, with a press badge clipped to her bag. Her dark brown hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and her eyes lit up as she took in Isabella's stand. "This is beautiful," she said, pointing to a canvas of a twilight cityscape. "Did you paint all of these yourself?" Isabella blinked, nodding slowly. "Yeah?" The journalist smiled, pulling out her phone. "I run a small online arts blog. I love finding hidden talent in the city. Mind if I take a few photos?" Isabella hesitated. "Wait, really? Really?" For the next few minutes, the woman took pictures of the paintings, of Isabella sitting at her stand, of the small handwritten sign explaining why she was selling them. Then she asked a question Isabella wasn't expecting. "What's your story?" Isabella told her about the hospital visits, the medical bills piling up, and how she refused to let her parents struggle alone. The journalist nodded thoughtfully, scribbling notes in the corner of her notebook. "People should hear this," she said. "I'll make sure they do." Isabella didn't think much of it. People made promises all the time. But the next morning, when she arrived at her stand, something was different. More people were stopping, not just to look, but to buy. A woman bought 2 paintings in a row. A young couple flipped through her canvases, debating which one to take home. By noon, she had sold more paintings than she had in the last 4 days combined. Then her phone buzzed. It was a message from Lucas, her best friend. "Dude, check this out." She clicked the link. It was an article. Her article. Fighting for art, fighting for life, the teen who's painting her way through a brain tumor. And at the bottom, thousands of shares. Isabella's heart pounded. This was real. But even then, she had no idea how big this moment was about to be. Because her biggest customer yet? He was already on his way. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the sidewalk, reaching past Isabella's stand as another wave of people rushed by. The city was a blur of movement, people lost in their own thoughts, their own problems, their own distractions. Isabella wiped the sweat from her forehead, trying to ignore the dizziness creeping in. Her body was begging for rest, but rest wouldn't pay for a brain tumor. She exhaled and adjusted the small stack of paintings on her table. The article on the art blog had helped. More people were noticing her work, but she was still far from her goal. Then something changed. A shift in the air. A quiet presence. A stillness that didn't belong in the middle of the city's chaos. She felt it before she saw him. A tall, older man had stopped at her stand. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't scrolling through his phone. He wasn't rushing to his next meeting. He just stood there, completely still, hands tucked into the pockets of a worn leather jacket. A cowboy hat was tilted low over his face. He was looking at her paintings, not just glancing, but really seeing them. At first, Isabella barely noticed him. She'd seen all kinds of customers before. Curious tourists, skeptical businessmen, shoppers pretending to be interested before walking away. But this guy? Something about him was different. She was too tired to figure out what. "See anything you like?" she asked, her voice rough from the long day. The man smirked. Just a little, just enough for her to notice. "Depends," he said. His voice was deep, slow, and oddly familiar. "What's the story behind these?" Isabella hesitated. Most people asked about prices, not stories. She glanced at him again, really looked this time. His face was lined with age, but his piercing blue eyes held something sharp, something steady, like they had seen 100 lifetimes and still weren't easily impressed. Something about him felt like an old Western come to life. She cleared her throat. "I paint because I have to," she said simply. "It's the only thing I can control right now." He didn't blink. He just waited, letting the silence do the work. So she told him about the diagnosis, about the ticking clock the doctors had given her, about how every brushstroke, every sale wasn't just about survival. It was about taking back her life. And when she finished, the man didn't offer sympathy. He just nodded. Then he reached for a painting. The man lifted a black and white canvas from the table, tilting it slightly in the light. It was one of Isabella's favorites, a vast desert landscape with the silhouette of a lone cowboy in the distance. The contrast between light and shadow, the endless sky above, it had taken her weeks to get it just right. The man studied it carefully, then, with a slow nod, he spoke. "I'll take this one." At first, Isabella didn't react. She'd done this a dozen times before. Customers picking a piece, handing over cash, and walking away without a second thought. But something about this moment felt different. She swallowed hard, running a hand over the back of her short hair. Okay, it's $167.23. The man didn't even reach for his wallet. Instead, he pulled out a checkbook. Isabella blinked, surprised. Who even used checkbooks anymore? She watched as he uncapped a pen, moving slowly, carefully. He wrote something down, tore the check from the book, and handed it to her. She hesitated, barely gripping the paper. Then she saw the number. Her breath caught. Her vision blurred at the edges as her eyes locked onto the check, the impossible number written in bold, neat handwriting. Not $167.23, but $43,000. Her hands started shaking. This, she whispered, barely able to form words. This can't be right. The man smirked, tilting his hat back slightly, revealing his face. Isabella's heart nearly stopped. Shaquille O'Neal? The legend? The icon? The man whose movies her dad had made her watch growing up. The man whose intense stare had defined generations of film. And now he was standing right in front of her. Buying her art. No, changing her life. She couldn't breathe. She started, shaking her head. I can't take this. Shaquille's eyes stayed steady. It's not charity, he said. It's a damn good painting. Isabella felt like the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. People were watching now. A few pedestrians had noticed, whispering, their voices growing louder. Someone took out a phone, snapping a picture. But Isabella didn't care about the crowd. She looked at Shaquille, really looked at him, and saw something deeper in his eyes. A quiet understanding. He knew what it meant to fight for something. He had spent his whole life doing it. And now, right here in the middle of a busy street, he had given her a chance to keep fighting too. Her hands clenched around the check. For the first time in a long time, Isabella felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. And the craziest part? This was only the beginning. Her world tilted. She stared at the check in her shaking hands, her mind racing to catch up. Not $167.23. Not even $1,000. $43,000. Her breath hitched. Her fingers tightened around the paper like she was afraid it might slip away. The sounds of the city faded. The rush of people, the honking of cars, the street musicians. It all blurred into background noise. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. She forced herself to blink, to check again, convinced she had read it wrong. But the number was still there. $43,000. Her stomach flipped. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. This, she whispered, her voice breaking. This must be a mistake. She looked up at the man, the cowboy in the leather jacket, the one who had spent the last few minutes flipping through her paintings like he had all the time in the world. And now, standing under the bright afternoon sun, she really saw him. The sharp blue eyes, the familiar smirk, the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime unshaken by the world around him. Her breath caught. O'Neal, the legend himself. The realization hit her like a speeding train. Her dad's favorite actor, the guy whose movies played in her living room every weekend when she was a kid. A Hollywood icon who wasn't just tough on screen but in real life too. And now he was standing right in front of her, handing her a check that could change everything. He watched her closely, reading the shock on her face. Then he smirked. No mistake, kid. His voice was low, steady. You just keep painting. Isabella swallowed hard. Her legs felt wobbly like they might give out. She opened her mouth, trying to say something. Thank you. Why are you doing this? I don't deserve this. But no words came out. Nothing in her life had ever prepared her for a moment like this. And it wasn't over yet. At first, nobody noticed. The city moved like it always did. Fast, distracted, unaware of the history happening right there on the sidewalk. Then, the first whisper. A teenage boy with earbuds in his ears stopped mid-step, tilting his head as he stared at O'Neal. His eyes widened. Wait, he muttered, his voice uncertain but getting louder. Is that Shaquille O'Neal? Nearby, a woman half raised her phone, squinting between Isabella's stand and the man in the worn-out cowboy hat. Then a second whisper, then a third. And then it happened. A rush of movement. People stopping in their tracks, heads turning, conversations halting. Someone gasped, another person snapped a photo. And just like that, the quiet afternoon turned into chaos. The whispers became shouts. "Oh my God, it's really him! Shaquille O'Neal is here, right here on this sidewalk. Wait, is he buying a painting? What's going on?" Phones shot up in every direction. A group of college students rushed forward, their voices full of disbelief. A businesswoman in high heels nearly tripped as she backtracked, pulling her assistant with her. Then the tipping point. A man in a suit, someone who had walked past Isabella's stand earlier without even glancing at it, stopped and turned around. "What's happening?" he asked, stepping closer. He looked at Shaquille, then at Isabella, then at the stack of paintings. His eyes landed on the check still clutched in her shaking hands. He saw the number. His jaw dropped. "Wait, he just bought a painting?" he blurted out. Another woman gasped. "For $43,000? That was it." The crowd exploded. People swarmed Isabella's stand, eyes darting between her and Shaquille, trying to make sense of what they were witnessing. And then the craziest thing happened. Someone reached for a painting. "I'll take this one." A man in a blue polo shirt called out, grabbing a cityscape painting and pulling out his wallet. Before Isabella could even process that sale, another hand shot forward. "And this one, how much is it?" A woman asked quickly, flipping through the last few pieces. Within minutes, the paintings that had been ignored for days were being snatched up one by one. People didn't even bargain, they didn't ask questions, they just bought. A teenage girl pulled out her phone and turned to her mom. "I need cash, now I want one before they're gone." Isabella sat there, stunned as her once quiet booth became the hottest spot in the city. It was crazy. And Shaquille? He just stood there. Thomas, as always, had his hands in his pockets, watching it all happen. Finally, he leaned in just enough for Isabella to hear and muttered, "Told you, kid. Just keep painting." Then, with a small tip of his hat, he walked away, leaving Isabella in the middle of a moment she never could have imagined. And the wildest part? This wasn't even the end, it was just the beginning. By the time Isabella got home that night, her phone was blowing up. Notifications flooded her screen, the constant ping, ping, ping of messages making her head spin. At first, she thought something was wrong. Then she saw the headlines. Shaquille O'Neal buys teens paintings for $43,000, and you won't believe why. Basketball legend helps young artist. Battling cancer in an unbelievable way. Teen's art booth becomes the talk of the nation after surprise visit from Shaquille O'Neal. Her picture was everywhere. A single image, Shaquille O'Neal standing at her tiny art booth, holding the black and white Western painting, was all over the internet. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, news sites. The video of him handing her the check? Over 3 million views. Isabella couldn't breathe. Her best friend Lucas called first. "Isabella, you are literally everywhere." "I don't even know what's happening," she whispered, staring at the flood of comments. Then the messages started coming. Not just from strangers, from buyers. People from all over the country, all over the world, wanted her paintings. "Hi, Isabella, I'd love to buy a piece of your work. Do you ship to Texas?" "Your story inspired me so much. I'd like to commission a painting, any price, just name it." "My daughter is also fighting cancer. Your strength gives us hope. I'd love to buy something to support you." Her hands shook as she scrolled. Her heart pounded. Dozens of messages turned into hundreds, then thousands, orders, donations, requests for interviews. Then the email that stopped her cold. With trembling fingers, she clicked on it. A prestigious New York gallery wanted to represent her. "Isabella, your story is remarkable. We'd love to showcase your work in our upcoming exhibition. Let's talk." Isabella pressed a hand against her chest, feeling her heart pound. This was real. She wasn't just selling paintings anymore. She had become a symbol of resilience. 1 month later, Isabella walked into the hospital for her final round of treatment, paid in full. Every bill, every debt, every crushing financial burden that had once felt impossible. Gone. All because of one painting, because of one moment, because a man in a cowboy hat had stopped, listened, and believed in her. The brain tumor had been tough, but this time she wasn't scared, because outside that hospital room, her future was waiting. A week after her final treatment, she received a letter, handwritten, from Shaquille O'Neal. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Isabella, your fight reminds me why some stories still matter. Never stop telling yours. Shaquille. Tears filled her eyes. She folded the letter carefully, pressing it to her chest. Then, later that night, she picked up a brush and started to paint. Her first official gallery show was set for the next month. Her inbox was flooded with commission requests. Her career was just beginning. But there was one painting she would never sell. The first one she had ever sold, the black and white Western landscape. It now hung in Shaquille O'Neal's private collection. A reminder that true grit? It's not just in Westerns. This story was insane. But the one on the right? Even crazier. If this story moved you in any way, like share and subscribe to the channel. The bigger the channel gets, the more amazing the stories will be.